So did you have a good week and weekend?
Indeed. Yeah, very nice. I have to it already feels like it was a month ago, but
What was that?
sorry, I think my computer's glitching now again. What's it doing?
My, I don't understand. My computer's been doing kind of odd things as well, but it seems to be, well, it's good enough that I'm just going to go ahead and go on because it looks like from my perspective, Joey, your screen is totally frozen up. Okay. Oh, the theme for this week is mid-century stuff. And mid-century should mean 1950, but it's actually going to be meaning 1960s, mid-1960s through the 70s, which, I guess that's close enough. Again, it's this idea that the titles of art movements is a little bit arbitrary or entirely arbitrary. Sometimes it describes the first thing that an art critic thought of when they came to the movement. And sometimes it is a time period. And sometimes it's the relative nearness to where things started happening. Hey, Brittany, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very nice. Joey was with us for a little bit, but his computer started acting a little funky. So I was just rambling on the off chance that anybody heard me. Do you have a good weekend?
Yeah, I can't complain.
Good. Well, not being able to complain has never stopped me. So don't let it be a hindrance to your freedom.
I try to, ignore the bad things.
But last weekend, my wife does functional wellness and trainings. And last weekend, she had a 3-day workshop in our home. Hey, Joy, you're back.
I'm back. Yeah, sorry. It works
And,
now.
no problem at all. But she needed me out of the house, and it just so happened that somebody called, asked me to come up to Salt Lake for a walkthrough. I was working on did the designs and building of the stained glass for the Taylorsville Temple. Glass Images and my team there. About 15, at one point there were about 15 people, but we put all those windows together. So they had me walk through because of the fact I was I'm an interfaith chaplain, not because I did the windows. And that was really kind of fun to share that. I love working on spiritual religious buildings. I love working on homes and doing that kind of thing. It's a lot of fun. But while I was up there, I found out that the historic Trinity AME Church on Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, which is 6th South in Salt Lake, have been vandalized. And so I was able to get the tools from Glass Images and fix that over the weekend too, which was really kind of cool. It's really nice when you can use your skill to solve a significant issue, I think, which was neat. So, and they had a national conference or regional conference that they had to get done. So that was neat. So all day Saturday, all day Sunday, I kept out of trouble fixing a church. If I had died doing that, I would have gone straight to heaven, I'm sure. Now I've got to wait for another opportunity.
There's no coincidences. You just had to be there to do that for them.
Well, it's such a cool congregation. It's a small congregation. And during church services, there was a woman who was visiting from Central Africa, and she sang a song, keying in a recording of her minister singing as well. So it was kind of a duet. That was really pretty cool. You don't get a chance to listen to that very often. So that was neat. But today, what we're going to be talking about is mid-century stuff, architecture, as well as some new developments in art expression that I think are really pretty cool. And we're dealing with a couple of people that are that set the tone, set the standard, and then also people that do stuff today that was kind of pioneered at this time, which I think is kind of neat. But I think, Joey, you're a fan of brutalist architecture, and that's a little bit of what we're looking at. What is interesting to me is this particular mid-century architecture is defined or recognized in a large part by its forerunners, the Bauhaus influence. And we can see quite a bit of it still in architecture today. And then we're also going to be looking at conceptual art that really started in the 60s, as well as artivism, or art as activism, which I don't know. I think that art is activism. I think we really see that with the Mexican regionalism we were looking at a couple weeks ago, because that was art designed specific, or not designed. It wasn't propaganda, but it was art that was specifically seen as a way to generate self-identity and teach history. And I think that was also true of the Harlem Renaissance too. Art that was really used to help people create an identity and take pride in who they were, which I think a lot of the times we see art as a way of processing information, like with the expressionists, or reacting in a positive way, as with like the color field artists, where the art almost was more meditation. But I think what 60s era conceptual art and art activism really required people to take an active role as viewers, but also really helped to solidify that possible property of art to help people feel good about who they were as human beings, and to maybe be a catalyst for positive change, perhaps. In a different way to propaganda. Propaganda is specifically steering how people think, and conceptual art and activist art, I think, is more on the lines of opening up possibilities for thinking. But that's just my thoughts. But I'm going to share my screen, and I didn't publish a lot of stuff. I was whining to Joey a little bit earlier about how I'm sure it was absolutely nothing to do with my fault. The computer was not appropriately responding. It probably is my fault, but I'll blame it on tools. I really like this picture. This is a really good example of mid-century architecture. This is when architecture starts moving from modernist architecture into kind of the same realm as postmodern art, where people are no longer doing things to really shift perspective, but they're working with the same kind of tools and palette. And in this kind of stuff, I see a lot of Bauhaus and that kind of rationalized design, where people are really thinking about elements like color and practicality of space and perhaps flexibility of space as well. And this is an article that I'm including, where it does draw a lot from Bauhaus and Prairie Style, which I think is Frank Lloyd Wright's and Green's perspective on the Bauhaus. They all started at about the same time. And at mid-century modern, we see some of the, have you guys seen the Fallout TV series at all on Amazon? It is a lot of fun. There are some jump scares, but it is a lot of fun. It's kind of a vision of the future taken from retro 50s. But there's elements of it that I can see in the mid-century design where, and just looking at this house, and there's a lot of these kinds of houses in places like California, Las Vegas, where there was a housing boom, and then a lot of those houses were well enough constructed that they are still surviving. We see this kind of very contemporary look in like the garage door and the front door and different things like that, but the lines are really clean, and I think there is some geometry that references the Bauhaus lines. And this gives some hallmarks to look out for. Clean lines and geometry, floor to ceiling windows, big windows. And I think this can come about because of a very conscious use of contemporary materials, or materials contemporary to the builders. Windows 1,000 years ago were a big thing and expensive to put in buildings because most of the building material needed to be used to support the weight of the building material. And that starts changing with Gothic architecture as people are really aware of the possibilities they saw in, Byzantine architecture. They could build bigger and taller by moving weight outside. And this is where people start actually using buildings in their construction. But in the 20th century, building materials can support a lot of weight without being an awful lot of material. So that's where we start seeing steel beam construction that is very specific to an awareness of engineering and load distribution. We see aluminum architecture. We see very conscious use of elements that are designed to be structurally sound. With the building, or with the use of geometry, with the Bauhaus sensibility and aesthetic, we see a lot of changes in elevation. Remember that Bauhaus building we were looking at that had a lot of different planes going in different directions and angles. This kind of use in geometry to make a very almost cubist style silhouette to a building. Decoration is rather minimal. We get decoration is in more of just the texture of the materials that are being used, the visual texture of materials. And then we get this awareness, this access to the outdoors, where the home is designed like Frank Lloyd Wright in Falling Water. The home is designed to fit with the landscape. And so this talks about that. It gives a little bit of imagery. But I thought that this video is a good video. It's about 7 minutes long. We'll go ahead and watch this. And this person makes the argument that
started to experiment with this.
This person makes the argument that mid-century design was forward-thinking enough that it is able to remain timeless. And I think you can look for those echoes of the Bauhaus kind of principles.
design ideas that we consider typical today actually came from 70 years ago. A design style based on simplicity and innovation. Mid-century was born, if you can believe it or not, in the 1940s and 50s, and the defining principles still remain relevant today. After World War II, there was this renewed sense of optimism, and combine that with technological advances happening at the time, many young architects started to experiment with this new way of thinking about our homes. Before, much of our houses here in Australia were mostly Victorians, with plenty of ornamentation, defined rooms, and small windows. Seeking something more Australian, the flipped was script. So grab yourself a martini and sink into your Eames chair as we take a look at some of the defining principles of mid-century homes and see why this style brings all the good vibes.
Now, this person is speaking in Australia, but I'm thinking, we can see the same thing in the U.S. architecture as well as European suburban architecture. We see the same kind of things.
But before we delve into the specifics, there's an overarching principle which wasn't really seen in Australian homes prior, and that is this connection to the environment around the house. So many of Melbourne's mid-century homes were built out in the growing suburbs, often on larger sites, and this allowed the homes to be able to orientate to best capture the sunlight. It wasn't so prescribed that the front door is here and then it's followed by 2 bedrooms and a living, etc., like a typical Victorian terrace. Instead, if the front of the property faced north, then that's where you place the living. Now, if I get you to close your eyes and picture a mid-century home, I'm confident that you envisioned a flat roof. The flat roof or low slope gable roofs that we tend to favour here in Australia was a radical departure from the typical hipped roof or hip and gable. This roof is definitely one of the more defining features of mid-century homes. And with advancements in material and construction, we were able to move away from steep terracotta roof tiles to those that were lightweight, flat, and made with metal. Remember that eye closing exercise from, 30 seconds ago? Did you also picture walls of windows? As I mentioned near the start, a real connection to place was critical in mid-century homes. And one of the most effective ways to do it was through expansive use of glass. This was made possible, again, through technological advancements happening at the time, allowing structure to be lightweight and even those window walls having some structural properties to them. This use of windows gave the occupants a real sense of belonging, and you could truly experience your garden and soak in the sunlight, creating that truly unique lifestyle at the time. One of the biggest innovations to come from mid-century design was the open floor plan. What used to be a room for the dining, a room for the living, a room for the kitchen, all of a sudden, the open plan allowed the entire family to be in one room together. However, it wasn't like how we see open floor plans today. There may have been some joinery to divide the spaces while keeping visual connections, or a sunken lounge that denoted the living space, or even sometimes the kitchen was partially obscured. Now, I'm just speculating, but I believe the open floor plan came from architects making sure that there was enough space to groove. I could be wrong, but I could also be right. I like to think I'm right. Materials and colour played a huge role in the stylistic output of mid-century design, with more natural materials such as timber and stone being used, mixed in with some groovy colours. Ceilings may have been lined with timber, cork flooring, perhaps a stone fireplace, or bricks were used for the exterior walls while also coming inside. But also, they embraced more manufactured materials such as stainless steel and chrome. The structural elements, such as columns and roof beams, were often left exposed. And the other aspect was colour. And while muted colours are often associated with mid-century, they were also bold, such as coral carpets that just scream party time. When you boil everything down or fry it in a pan or put it in the oven, mid-century homes were about embracing simplicity. The ornate ceiling roses, iron lacework, and intricate furniture pieces from the Victorian era was simplified. Now it was about clean lines, zero ornamentation, functionality, and simple forms. Less is more was the thinking, and that was applied to everything discussed in this video so far. The last design principle of Australian mid-century modern has to do with the gardens. There was a very English approach to gardens prior to the 1940s, but they didn't always hold up too well in the February heat waves that we can experience here in Australia. Picture a penguin in the desert. It's not exactly a positive visual. The propagation of indigenous plants in the 1950s meant that there was greater accessibility to natives, allowing the Australian garden to come into its own. There was also a sense of taking the modernist ideas and principles of connecting architecture to time and place, but applying it to the design of the garden. This connection was amplified through the design of the home, where you could sit in your living room and feel as though you were in your garden through that expansive use of glass. There is no denying the impact mid-century architecture has had on design and the timelessness of these principles. I mean, a flat roof, expansive windows, open plan, natural and neutral material palette, simplicity, a native garden. I mean, that's just what we strive for our homes today. However, there was a period where mid-century was pushed aside in favour of the McMansion, and the heritage value of these mid-century homes aren't seen, leaving many demolished and many more at risk. But it does seem to be a renewed love and interest in this style of home, and it's not hard to see why. So hopefully these groovy mid-century modern pads can be saved for future generations to swoon over.
I like his take on that. I think it's a lot of fun. And I see a lot of those kinds of homes in areas like, for example, Las Vegas and California. And let's see. I'm sorry, my computer was beeping at me. Could you, as he was showing some of those images of the mid-century homes, did you see any resonance with the Bauhaus architecture that we'd seen earlier? And I don't think there's any coincidence to that at all, because a lot of the times the architects that designed the mid-century architecture were ones who either had originally trained under Bauhaus influenced artists or had moved from Bauhaus inspired architecture forward. Like Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the definers of mid-century home architecture, and he did follow an awful lot of principles of the Bauhaus work in his earlier architecture, which I think is really fascinating. I love the clean lines. I love the I love that whole idea of embracing the outside, the outdoors with the living area. And as you know, working with glass, I see an awful lot of the of that materials use, like the floor to ceiling glass windows and things like that, as I've had to replace quite a bit of them. There's three architects that I picked for this. One was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and you'll recognize his name. He was a Bauhaus artist. Another one is Le Corbusier, who did a lot of stuff in response to the Bauhaus. And of course, a big one is Frank Lloyd Wright. And let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, well, we've already talked about them. We visited their work quite a bit in earlier stuff. And the mid-century architecture is just a continuation, or is a continuation of their work. So I'll have the videos and stuff like that that you can look on. But I was hoping, I wanted to, instead of looking at their work more closely, I wanted to move on a little bit and allow you to look at their stuff. There's two other things that I wanted to cover today. One is conceptual art, and the other is art as activism. So if it's okay with you, we're just going to look really briefly at some of the architecture from those guys, and then we're going to move on to those other things. So let's. Okay, so this is some of the things that Le Corbusier did that tie into the more mid-century architecture. This is one of his buildings here, and you can see the influence, very powerful influence of the Bauhaus and his use of color. And we just want to go down and, you know, if this website is going to cooperate with me, it looks like it's having a hard time loading. I am sorry, it looks like, okay, here we are getting some of the imagery. Okay, so this is very definitely placed in mid-century architecture. This is 1967, this building here. And we can see some of the brutalist lines, like that IBM building that is at the opening of the module. But we can also see the use of colors and the Mondrian almost style use of the verticals and horizontal lines. This is this was designed by him, but built several years after his death. And this, we can see some of those mid-century lines like we saw with the Australian video, but he's also putting in some interesting elements through here that kind of speak to me a little bit of postmodernism and kind of hearken to more lines of like that, the furniture design that he was working on that we looked at when we're looking at Bauhaus as well. This, I think, is more of a return to the Bauhaus stuff. This is an earlier piece of work that he did, where you have the planar planar structure and the strong use of geometry. This is a structure that was designed. The thing that kind of frustrates me about this website, it's a really good resource, but the way that they've designed it, it's very flexible and it keeps covering up areas as we move on, which kind of irritates me. And this is not a linear progression of his designs. It does jump around a little bit. And if you take into account the time periods, then it does start to make sense. So this is earlier right here, and this is later or more recent. And this gives us a little bit more of that feeling of the mid-century stuff that we were looking at. This is quite a bit earlier. This kind of leads into the Bauhaus a little bit, that World War I era. This is very much Bauhaus influence. This is moving a little bit more towards the modern. This, I think, is really interesting because it feels more of that brutalist kind of feeling. This almost reminds me of the Russian constructivism. And it's an architecture that is really making use of the tensile properties of the materials that are available to the architect. This feels to me to be very much mid-century, so it's a little bit later, where he still is very much influenced by the Bauhaus principles with a lot of that geometry, but we see that kind of opening up to the exterior that is a hallmark of the mid-century work. And this, I love this because it feels very much like Piet Mondrian with those colors and horizontal vertical lines, but it also speaks to me a little bit of Japanese architecture the Japanese home architecture, which I think is really fun. This, I really love this. This feels to me like it's more organic, but it still has a lot of those elements, the geometric elements. It just feels a lot more organic. This very much feels like almost a neo Bauhaus, but it's combined with that brutalist kind of Russian constructivism too, making a lot of use of the tensile strength of the cement, and as well as having this kind of playful grid work that feels, a little bit of that Mondrian kind of feel to it in the windows. These are floor to ceiling windows, really expansive windows, but I don't know if you can see, they're using 2x2 frames throughout the windows, or 1x1 frames, which is another thing that you see in mid-century architecture, where even though they will have the expansive window space, they will use small frames because the architects like to explore the textural component of just the framing material, which I think is super fun. There's no practical reason for it. It's just done because they enjoy doing it. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing to look at. Again, I apologize for the motion sickness you may have gotten because of the design of the website. And I wanted to look at some of things with Frank Lloyd Wright architecture as well, where we're going from earlier part of his career to more recent stuff. I say more recent, it's still 1950s is the most, is probably close to the most recent. But I think you can kind of see the same kind of thing going on. Like this is more contemporary. This is closer to the time of Bauhaus, and you can really see a lot of that geometry in there. And this, he's also putting a little bit of the Tlaloc Mayan work in there. This is very much Craftsman, but it's influenced quite a bit by the Bauhaus geometry. And I think, you can see Bauhaus influence. This is, World War I, and then more mid-century openness, but with quite a bit of that organic flair that Le Corbusier was doing. Very early stuff. But these are drawings of the house, and this is rather a smeared photo, which is disappointing. But this is very early, 1900, and I think we can kind of see that 19th century influence very strongly in this, but pushing a little bit towards modern lines. And then you look at this, it feels very contemporary. It has a lot of those mid-century lines that we were looking at in that video from Australia. There's still elements of the Bauhaus to that, but I think it's really fascinating to see that. And this one is really interesting to me, because here this very heavily Bauhaus influence, but this is more of that mid-century design. But if we look at that Le Corbusier house that was built 40 years after his death, I'm going to try to pull back to that and see if I can find it again. These guys were very much thinking along similar lines. So this was designed by Le Corbusier at about the same time that Frank Lloyd Wright designed this. And they were not on the phone with each other all the time, but it is fascinating to me that they were both dealing with very similar issues of design and coming up with very similar solutions. One in the US and one in France. And I just think that kind of thing is really cool to see. So I want to move away from that. And this is going to seem like a big departure. Getting into conceptual art and activism art we're dealing in the same decade. We're dealing end of 50s, early 60s. And we talked about the context, the social context of what was going on in the world at this time in Europe and the United States. And it's interesting to me that different artists are responding to this in different ways. You know, we've talked about during wartime, you have love ballads and marching songs. You know, people respond differently. You still have the threat of the bomb. You still have very much an energized feeling of changing of the guard so much from the almost complacent consumerism of the 40s, late 40s and 50s into a realization that things are not going to stay static. Things need to change culturally. And this isn't true just for the United States. This is true for Europe and a lot of the world, because elsewhere in the world, you also see a departure from colonialism. You know, with the big turning point was the establishment of Israel as a country after World War II. And that, I think that was a touch point, because then you start seeing a lot of decolonializing starting in the early 50s with the partition of India, you know, into Pakistan and India. And then you see revolutions taking place as people are trying to establish their own identity. And so the 1960s, that kind of revolution spills over into cultural revolution, where you get development of people that are sick of waiting, for example, in just one aspect, sick of waiting for civil rights to be acknowledged for everybody. And so you get a rather vocal activist groups like with the Black Panthers and the Martin Luther King, you know, and Black American Muslim movements. But then the same thing spills over into feminist expression. And it is really interesting to me that this is all happening. We've already seen color field painting. We've seen abstract expressionism. We see all this as responses to this kind of a thing. And I think that one thing that's fascinating to me about all this is we also get artists that are trying to express perhaps their frustration and their emotions about how things should change, as well as artists that are really demanding that people take responsibility for their thoughts. And this is where we get conceptualism. We talked about the real departure of modern art from previous types of art was, you know, the birth of modern art is in Impressionism, where artists start taking ownership for their work and expressing what they see and their impressions of the world. Up until then, for the 1,000 years up until then, it seemed that art really artists really depended on a shared visual vocabulary. So it was important that a horse looked like a horse, for example. And with Cubism, that's when the artists really started demanding that you as a viewer, or we as viewers, take responsibility and help them create the art. You know, that's where we get the phenomenology invested into it. And with conceptualism, what we see is a shift from, how can I say this? It's a shift forward in the continuum of an artist expecting you to be responsible as a viewer. And before conceptualism, artists are still working with physical materials, and that's the end product. With conceptualism, artists are using the physical materials to sculpt people's ideas. You know, abstract expressionists would use paint to create the the canvas, the painting. And with conceptual artists, if they use paint or painting, the painting was used as a tool to sculpt a person's concept. And this is where we start getting things like this, which is very problematic for a number of reasons. One is it's problematic because if you're a gallery, how the hell are you gonna? I'm sorry, Joey, I know you're sensitive to language. How the heck are you going to sell this? Because you're not, previous art movements, you're still working with physical material. And the conceptual artists are using the physical material as the art implements to sculpt thoughts. So how are you going to sell the thoughts? And that's where it is. They are requiring you. Before, the artists are inviting you to participate in a conversation with them as intelligent viewers. And now the artists are requiring you as viewers to generate meaning, participate with them directly in generating meaning. And so you get Joseph Kosuth is really good at generating this kind of conversation, where he creates a platform for you to really consider what is going on, what is real. Do you guys remember Plato's allegory of the cave? Where it's all the person knows is the shadows on the wall, and they're told what to think about them. And then somebody's forced outside and they suddenly see the actual things that were casting the shadows. And then they have to come back and try to explain that. That's the kind of thing that's going on. That's the level of cognitive shift that is going on with the development of conceptual art. And it's interesting to me. We can throughout the late 50s and early 60s, there are a number of things that are going on with the government and everything else. You have the Cold War. You have the ever-present threat of the atomic bomb. You have the doomsday clock that, there's a big thing every year where they move the hand forward or back or whatever. It's fascinating to me that this is also the time where the FBI records that serial killing is a real thing. I mean, this is where serial killers actually get their start. You have H.H. Holmes, who was one of the first serial killers quite a bit earlier. But as far as having serial killer task force and being aware of it as a real thing that has to be policed, that did not happen until the Cold War and the threat of the atomic bomb and the capacity for journalism to really be embedded in areas of conflict. And I think that this really represented a significant cognitive shift for people who could no longer pretend that all the world had no impact on them, and B, to really depend on government as an honest institution. And it really took the rug out of a lot of people. There is a TV series that it was inspired by Mindhunter, which was a book written by one of the defining FBI profilers. And in that, this conversation is played out where he talks about how much the world has changed in just 10 years. And it represents a fundamental shift of our relationship as individuals with things like culture and government. And it's a dramatic shift, where in previous epochs, similar shifts would take generations. This happened in 5, 8, 10 years. So it really doesn't surprise me that all this kind of stuff happened all at the same time. And I am very grateful that a group of people decided to transform this shift into new art forms. Because this represents a fundamentally new art form, where the sculpture that takes place resides in the mind and the imagination of the individual who encounters it. So I want to back off a little bit from my own blabbering and watch this short video here.
So now we're moving into conceptual art, and this is a vast change because this is art that is not being created to sell as such. We're not worried about the materials and the time and the technique necessarily. In fact, in some cases, the artist is not even creating their own piece. Sometimes they're conceptualizing it and having someone else create it. No, instead, conceptual art is about the conversation. So when you look at these pieces, it's not about how stunning this painting of the Annunciation is or how phenomenal this portrait is. Instead, it's about the conversation, which usually starts with one question. Is it art? And then from there, it takes a myriad of other directions. So let's try and define the undefinable. Let's try and define conceptual art. Now, conceptual art is a movement that prizes ideas over the formal or visual components of artwork. So they're focusing on that conversation, on the idea, not the composition. And we see an amalgam of various tendencies rather than a tight, cohesive movement. Conceptualism took a myriad of forms, such as performances, happenings, and ephemera. From the mid-1960s through the mid-1970s, conceptual artists produced works and writings that completely rejected standard ideas of art. Their chief claim that the articulation of an artistic idea suffices as the work of art. Does
this kind of idea resonate with you with any of the other movements we looked at?
This to me feels a lot like Dadaism.
Yeah, quite a bit. And it's fascinating to me that the seminal events around the Bauhaus and Dada was First World War. And here we have Cold War and threat of nuclear holocaust. And you get a revisioning of Dada in conceptual art, but you also get a revisioning of Bauhaus in mid-century architecture. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think that's really a fascinating parallel.
Also implied that concerns such as aesthetics, expression, skill, and marketability were all irrelevant standards by which art was usually judged. Now, this is going to be an issue, not for the artist, but for the gallery, because galleries need to sell art, and a lot of conceptual art isn't really something you can sell. You might be able to record it, sometimes you can photograph it, but oftentimes it's not something you're really going to sell. It might be created for the space, it might be an installation, it might be a giant shark in a tank. You never know, but it's unlikely to sell. So it does rather change ideas of the art world. So drastically simplified, it might be seen to many people that what passes for conceptual art is not in fact art at all. Much like Jackson Pollock's drip paintings or Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup cans seem to contradict what previously had passed for art. But we're seeing a change of definition here. Even today, in the current world, the definition of art is very different than it was 100 or 150 years ago. Artists are moving in a different direction. They're focusing on different things. But it's important to understand conceptual art in a succession of avant-garde movements. We've been moving in this direction for a long time as we move from Cubism to Dada to abstract expressionism to pop art, etc. We're constantly simplifying. We're constantly changing the definition of art very, very slowly up to the modern day. Don't forget, this change from what we would term realism of the mid-19th century to today's conceptual art takes place over 150, almost 170 years now. I mean, that is a considerable amount of time. This is not happening nearly as quickly as people like to think. It's not a sudden idea. And they're self-consciously expanding the boundaries of art. Conceptualists themselves are at the extreme end of this avant-garde tradition. In truth, it's irrelevant whether these extremely intellectual pieces of art match one's personal views of what art should be, because the fact remains the conceptual artists successfully redefine the concept of a work of art to the extent that their efforts are widely accepted as art by the collectors, galleries, and museum curators. So really, if this tiny group of people, the art historians, the art critics, the collectors, etc., accept it as art, it's art. We kind of gave those people that responsibility. We gave the museum curators, the art historians, the gallery owners the permission to say what is and isn't art. It's just implicit in the social contract. So when they accept it as art, it really is art. If you don't accept it as art, that's different. That's a personal opinion. But society as a whole, through its chosen representatives, has defined conceptual art as art.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best.
What do you think about that?
Sorry, I'll jump in. I think it's interesting. There's it feels like a tug of war. It feels like these guys are thumbing their nose up at the art world and basically saying, we think you're stupid. We're going to make this stuff that's weird art. And it's more about the ideas than it is about being able to sell it and all these things, creating all these problems for the art world. But the art world is still keeping their stranglehold on being able to decide what art is. And so they're ultimately kind of going with it. And like, I don't know, it's like a really strange contention.
Yeah, it's a really odd relationship, definitely. And one thing I am really grateful for it, because then it expands the possibilities for expression as well. You know, and we open up the door to ideas such as street art being valid. You know, we open up the ideas to performance art or conversations being valid. You know, happenings, all this kind of stuff. And I think that for me, that's really exciting, because it also opens up the possibilities of expression to include people that don't feel like they're classically trained or have the proper qualifications to be an artist of a different kind. And it's somebody who has an idea and something that they want to express or they feel compelled to share. It's okay now to do that. And I think it's wonderful. It's really liberating. On the other hand, it opens up the door just as equally for people who have absolutely no business pretending that they are legitimate artists. And there are some examples where people avoided getting arrested for public indecency because they claimed that it was a performance art piece. You know, and but you know, counter that as well, you also get people who are very serious about what they're doing, that are doing a performance art piece that is legitimate. So, you know, you got to take the good and the bad. I think it was, I can't remember who it was. I'm going to attribute it to Prince, even though I don't know if it was Prince, who said something along the lines of, as the cost of production falls, so does quality. And but counter to that, you also get a much lower bar of entry, which means you get people that are exceptional emerging on the scene who never could have otherwise. And music, the popular music and contemporary music is a really good example of that really broad spectrum, because you get really truly awful music with the lower bar of entry, and then you get also exceptional performers that would never have been able to get in on the music scene without the low bar for entry. And I think that is just astounding to me. Yes, Brittany.
I was just thinking about how like social media in today's world has done the exact same thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And again, you get a broad, huge array of horrible examples, but because of the easy access to social media, you also get a lot of really exceptional quality material that never would have happened otherwise. In particular, I'm thinking there are a number of really exceptional musicians in Yoruba areas, Western Africa, for example, that are really making some significant waves in the West and in Europe, who never would have had a voice 10 years ago. And I'm talking about performers, I'm talking about dancers, I'm talking about musicians, as well as a lot of artists. Yinke Shonobara is an artist that I really, really appreciate, who uses his leverage and recognizability in the UK and Europe to help a lot of these artists get a toe up through social media and things like that they never would have even had access to art materials, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So yeah, definitely. I think that's just amazing. Of course, the fairy godfather of conceptual art is, anybody want to guess?
Isn't it Duchamp?
Yeah, absolutely. He only made 13 ready-mades during his career, and he turned to music and writing later on. But those ready-mades that he made really defined or helped to define a world in which conceptual art could take place. Here we have a bicycle wheel, and some of his really famous stuff, Nude Descending a Staircase, was his foray into cubism. But I think what really still kind of offends some people is that Marcel Duchamp was good enough that he could explore something with a couple things, and he could define the movement, when other artists would do 100 paintings to define something. Marcel Duchamp could define something with 13 sculptures. And that is really frustrating to a lot of people. But I think it's evidence of just his sheer brilliance. And this is, we don't have time to watch the whole video, but this is his In Advance of the Broken Arm piece, which is a shovel, basically. And what I like about this video is it really talks about the history behind it. So I recommend watching this, but all it is a snow shovel that's standing up like that. Coupled with the title, In Advance of a Broken Arm, it really helps to define what conceptual art is all about. And I think it's fascinating. Because when you see this, it is just a snow shovel. That's it. No emotional attachment, nothing else. That's it, period. Couple it with the title, In Advance of a Broken Arm. What does that start forcing you to do with it?
Yeah, it forces you to it engages your imagination, and it forces you to create a narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And it not only is asking you to be an intelligent viewer, but it is requiring you to take an active role as an intelligent viewer. You're the one that is really collaborating with Marcel Duchamp to generate meaning to what this is. And it forces all sorts of connotations and thoughts regarding the artwork, beginning with the fact that it's a snow shovel in a gallery. And so I think it's really is very illustrative of what conceptual art is all about. One of the people that I really think is amazing with conceptual art is Sol LeWitt. What is fascinating about Sol LeWitt is he created art by developing and responding to ideas about who participates in the art, how the art is defined, how the art can be marketed, what is that space? What Sol LeWitt would do is create a set of parameters. And then, like Joseph Kosuth as well, he would create certificates of authenticity, where if a museum purchased the certificate, they also committed to ensuring that the directions were followed. And so he would say, a black wall, people would create white lines with specific patterns. They had, had to be like this and this and this. And so he would give parameters, and then the gallery would purchase from him a certificate of authenticity that was numbered and dated, committing them to ensuring that whoever participated in creating the art had to follow his directions. So this is audience participation art, where volunteers are required to follow specific directions, but follow the directions in light of their own personalities. And so every Sol LeWitt performance art piece is unique. And there are several different examples. He would also create stuff, but a lot of the times he would give specific parameters for other people to follow. So he would give the directions to the printmaker, saying this is what you need to do, and allow the printmaker to come up with their own version. And then he also wrote paragraphs on conceptual art, as well as sentences on conceptual art. And here you can see the sentences that he wrote, and it is reminiscent to me of those manifestos that we saw, the early 20th century manifestos that everybody and their brother were writing about their art. And then the kicker is that shows Sol LeWitt's his sense of humor is at the very bottom. These sentences comment on art, but are not art. However, the sentences on conceptual art is itself a conceptual art piece. And I just love that kind of noodling. Do you guys watched the Matrix movies, right? Do you remember the first time he meets the Oracle, and she says, "Don't worry about it." And he says, "What?" And he moves, and he knocks over the vase. She said, "I told you not to worry about it." He said, "Well, how did you know I was going to knock it over?" And she said, "Oh, but what will really bake your noodle is if I hadn't said anything, would you have done it?" And I love that, because this is what Sol LeWitt is playing with, that kind of idea. Jenny Holzer is another one of these who deals with this idea of conceptual art with her written statements. And we're going to look at a couple others as well. But I think it's pretty amazing the kinds of stuff that these artists produced. And then one of my favorites, another conceptual artist, she was, because her husband was a musician, and I think people expected her to be a serious musician as well, and they didn't understand that a lot of her music was intended to be conceptual. It was based on No theater, NOH theater from Japan. It wasn't intended to be easily consumed by a populist Western audience, and it never was. But because people insisted on putting that narrative in front of her work, a lot of her stuff was just completely disregarded, which I think is a shame. So, but she is a conceptual artist that really dealt a lot with ideas of identity and extrapolation of identity, construction of identity, construction of place, awareness of place, as well as sexuality. And our work, once you take away from the equation expectations of a Western musician, which again she is not never intended to be, and allow yourself to look at her work from the perspective of this is a Japanese expatriate who is coming to Western society, very much trying to reconnect with her Japanese roots and also establish her identity as an individual and speak to that process in everybody. Then I think her art starts taking on this lyrical, poetic quality that is really beautiful. And I just think it's really wonderful to see her work in that light. One of my, I wanted to share this with you. This is a piece that she did that is a little bit more recent, called "This Room Moves at the Same Speed as the Clouds," and which I think is another lyrically poetic piece as well. She's also done stuff where she'll do action calligraphy, is what she calls it, where she takes a mop-sized brush, and she's not making calligraphy. What she's doing is putting calligraphy strokes onto a wall so that everybody can engage in the process. And it's an awful lot of fun to watch those videos. But "This Room Moves at the Speed of Clouds" is a retrospective in some respects, but it's also a calm space where things move slowly because it is moving at the speed of clouds. Well, I think it's beautiful, and I recommend very much going to this video and watching it. You know, because like I said, it is a retrospective, but it's a retrospective that's intended to provide a space for contemplation, which I think is beautiful. But again, you know, she's brilliant with that title. What are some of the other things that you think of as you think of the title, "This Room Moves at the Speed of Clouds"?
No, that's like it's like both calming imagery, but it could also be really like chaotic and like violent. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and very definitely. And which I think is one of the gifts that conceptualism has given us. We're allowed to, like you said earlier, Joey, provide our own narrative to things or help to construct the narrative. So we can build a narrative around the title. Other things I'm thinking of is, we use pareidolia to find imaginative shapes in the clouds. And she's also inviting us to find connections that she never intended with the art that she's making. I think that's really beautiful as well.
Sorry to cut in here. I just saw a piece of hers that at the SF MoMA. It's called "Mend with Love," and she has a table full of broken pottery shards, and then a bunch of different twine and glue. And anyway, you sit down and make your own piece of art, and then go put it on a shelf.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
I love that idea. But it's a very different way of thinking about the creative process and our relationship to the creative process, which, I love the color field painting we were looking at because it feels so healing and restorative coming out of World War II and dealing with Cold War era. And conceptual art, I think, is another thing that opens up the door to a landscape of inclusiveness and healing as well. Anybody can participate as both a spectator and a creator, and it's wide open to interpretation, which I think is beautiful as well. So without any wasted effort on trying to give you a practical transition, we're going to go right into art as activism. And why would I want to show Picasso's Guernica as to introduce art as activism?
The activist art.
Yeah, exactly. This was done by Picasso to really make a strong statement against Ferdinand's just arbitrary attack on a town to see if Hitler's gift would work. You know, the 2-mile long shot guns. The Guernica was chosen as a target completely on a whim, and it was bombed into utter destruction. It completely erased the town. The people involved had no idea what was going on. The Spanish dictator did not care whatsoever. And it is absolutely no surprise that Guernica and Picasso himself were both at threat for the remainder of his life because of that. You know, it is really a heartrending painting. I do want to share this short video. It's only about 2 minutes, and we do have the time for it.
An artist who paints murals might...
Oh, sorry. Here we go.
Sometimes people are unhappy with decisions that the government makes or doesn't make. But the beauty of a democracy is that those people have the power to effect change through something called activism, taking direct action to achieve.
I just want to mention that I really like this. I have a friend who moved here from Pakistan in the early 70s. He moved here, well, his family was from Pakistan and India, but he moved here specifically because his family were Muslim, but they were the wrong kind of Muslim. And he said that one of the beautiful things about moving to the United States is that you don't have to constantly be afraid of, you know, for your life. You don't have to be in fear of your life all the time. If you don't like the government, you don't necessarily take your life in your hand by speaking out. You have an opportunity to voice your concerns. And if you really don't like the way things are, wait a year or two and you can vote the people out. And, you know, I love that attitude of, you know, and being an active participant in the governance process. But that's what this video reminded me of.
A social or political goal. Some of the most visible activism comes from artists who create work that inspires people to think critically about the society they live in. Activist art can come in many forms, but whether it's in a museum, a public space, on the stage, or through media, it always comments on the issues of the day, tries to give a voice to those who are voiceless, and holds the government accountable for its actions. An artist who paints murals might want to highlight issues in their community. A playwright might create a play that features marginalized characters or stories. A musician might choose musical styles or lyrics that celebrate a community whose art has been suppressed or misappropriated. Activist art is meant to challenge the status quo, the existing conditions in a society. Printmaking, for example, dates back to the American Revolution. It's inherently democratic because it allows an artist to easily reproduce many copies of the same image and share them quickly with others. It's especially useful when paired with another form of activism, like protesting or marching. Art can be a powerful democratic tool because it empowers people to talk about their experiences. Art inspires emotion in those who see it and motivates people to take action. So look around your community. Do you see examples of activist art? What does activist art inspire you to do?
Now, that is about activist art in general, and it really highlights examples of activist art from a rather broad spectrum of time. But what is fascinating to me is that activist art didn't really become a thing until this same time period. You know, what wasn't even given it wasn't really given its own label. And now we can see that there is a lot of activist art throughout a lot of different time periods. One of the assumptions a lot of people have is that activist art is a product of anger. And a lot of the times it can be, but it's not necessarily. Activist art is designed specifically to engage people to the point where there is a shift towards activity. You know, where there's a catharsis that takes place, where people are engaged to do something rather than just think about it. And one of the artists that I really like that deal with this is Barbara Kruger. She was a lot of her stuff is a little bit more contemporary, but she designs her work to look like it fits into that 1950s, 1960s art space. And some of these artists that we're looking at were inspired by work that was done in the 60s, and that's a lot of the style that they carry. But some of the artists that we're looking at are quite a bit more contemporary. Except for, I'm showing Barbara Kruger, but what I want to show first is probably the lady that really put her stamp on this. And this is the lady that that inspired the term her story instead of history. Let's see. This is Judy Chicago. She defined the birth of feminist art with her, with a lot of her works, including one of them was the dinner party. And I'm going to show that really quick here. I do have a very short video about the dinner party that I think is worth showing. And this is like smack dab in the middle of this whole time period. She did stuff in the 60s leading up to this. Dinner party specifically happened in the early 70s.
You know, the dinner party is structured as a narrative through Western civilization, and the way Western civilization is usually presented is through the lives and accomplishments of various heroes. So in the case of the dinner party, that same civilization is presented through the lives of female heroes. And I decided I wanted the plates to rise up as you moved around the triangular table as a metaphor for liberation. But it isn't just a straight rise. They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down, they go up, they go down, because actually that relates to the currents of history. It hasn't been a straightforward progress. There have been periods that have been better and worse for women through history. And the rise and fall of the plates chronicles that. And then, of course, with the rise of the international feminist movement in the 19th century, then the plates begin to just develop and develop and develop and start pushing off the plate surface, trying to get off the table, because after all, women don't belong on a table.
I want to see if I can find an image of the dinner party. There we go. This was a work that she conceived and then started putting together years before, and I think it was first displayed in like 72, 74, right around there. But her work is specifically designed to engage people in processes of societal catharsis, as well as rebuilding identity. And I think her stuff is pretty freakishly amazing. And it can be uncomfortable to look at. A lot of activist art can be uncomfortable. Another one of my favorite activist artists is Betty Saar. And she was born in California. She's African American. She was raised in the 50s and 60s, and she started doing assemblage art, which is and she would put elements together that on the face of them would seem really potentially offensive, but the way she puts it together becomes well, I'm sorry, I'll just show you this. Okay, here we go. So she's contemporary to Judy Chicago. They're both still alive. They're both kicking ass. I mean, both very active. Sorry, Joey. I'm sorry. I don't want to offend you. Okay. This is her liberation of Aunt Jemima. And she's a feminist. She's also very much about reclaiming identity. And I love this work because she's taking incredibly derogatory and dismissive depictions and turning it into something very different. You know, it feels to me that this starts to become empowering. And there's so many different elements to it. I think it's really wonderful. Another good example right here of, I'm sorry, not right here. Another good example of activist art that is very contemporary is the musical Hamilton. You know, very, very much so. And these are not intended necessarily to be expressions of just sheer outrage and anger. They are just like Greek theater, which is, you know, one of the earliest examples of activist art. Greek theater, Aristotle said, was designed specifically to foment catharsis in the audience members, you know, to force an emotional and personal change, either to reestablish family ties, rebuild yourself as a worthwhile human being, reconnect with the spiritual realm, or any of those things. But it was designed specifically to get you to act as an individual, to make yourself a better person. And I think that is a really good definition of activist art. Two of the other, well, you talked about Barbara Kruger, but another activist artist that I really appreciate, who's a little bit later than Betty Saar and Judy Chicago, is Keith Haring. And his work is still very much a part of our cultural landscape and still informing a lot of things. What he did was take wasted space in an urban landscape and using ostensibly, you know, humor and approachable imagery, he's able to confront a lot of really dangerous topics. And some of them are just designed to be fun to look at, but a lot of them were also very scary things. And he dealt with sexuality and racism and just the disenfranchised in a way that did not read as confrontational anger. And so I love his stuff. I think it's beautiful. And he did things that were just fun. Like he would use subway platforms and areas where you pass through the tunnel and see all the moving columns by the windows. And he would develop spaces so that he would have short animations. And so you could be riding on the subway and see these fun little animations going on that were really great. So we did kind of jump around a little bit in time, but mostly staying to late 50s throughout the 60s and into the 70s a little bit. I do think that these three elements do fit together because they are all responding to earlier movements, kind of revisioning them from similar cultural I'm sorry, I completely lost track of the word. Touch points, you know, like the Bauhaus and Dada, was the touch point for that was World War I. The touch point for these was pretty much the Cold War, and the Korean War, and those kinds of things, the emergence of the Vietnam War, all that kind of stuff coming into it. And I think they're revisiting very similar concepts, and but putting I think the best word is maybe a more mature spin on it. As maturity maybe not means fully grown, but more experience. So you feel the Bauhaus influence in the mid-century architecture, and it feels like it's influenced also by the architectural growth and the expansion of material use between the Bauhaus and 1960, and as well as looking at conceptual art and activist art, we can see that there is an echo of Dadaism, but they've already processed Dadaism through pop art and maybe grown up a little bit with that experience. So I think it's really a fascinating thing. Like Judy Chicago said, that history is cyclical. It's not a straight progression. It's not a linear progression. And I think we see that as well. What are your thoughts about the stuff that we've looked at?
I think so the century has just been so like unhinged, like so many crazy things, advancements and technology and wars, and it's just such a strange century anyway. And so I feel like it's been really fascinating to sort of to see that history through a different language, through visual language. It's different than how we normally process that century. And I think it's been really fun to see how these threads are sort of like connected and pulling each other. But it's also just like, I don't know, it's a different way to digest the madness that the century was.
Yeah, very, very much, very, very much so.
I find it interesting that, the architecture is like simplified, and then we move into the art, and the art is just like whatever goes.
I think that it's really fascinating, and it almost seems you get Mondrian, who simplified painting, and you get the color field painters or minimalists who really simplified things to just like single spectrum colors and things like that. But I think with conceptual art and activism, rather than maybe simplifying it, parsing it down, it's more targeted. They're asking what is art really, and they're honing in on that specific thing more closely. And I think it's fascinating. Probably not. I'm probably just pulling that out of my ear, but I do think it's really interesting. But I love the fact that even though the architecture is simplified, it feels to me that it's simplified towards aesthetics and appreciation of the form, not what's the bare minimum that we can get away with. And I really like that. I like that overlaying of aesthetic hope to that process of simplifying and parsing down. I think that's really kind of nice. Especially considering this is in a time period that, like Joy said, it's absolutely crazy, completely out of sorts, and still people. The big things are, where can we find something beautiful? I really like that. I like that perspective. Well, thank you guys. Thanks for sticking through and staying awake the whole time. I dozed off a little bit. I'm glad you didn't, but I appreciate that. Next week, we're going to cover a bunch of stuff really quickly. And before we go, I do want to talk about the final. The final is going to be for an online class. Everybody has to participate. And what I'm going to do is Monday morning, the first moments of the finals week, I'm going to release the final assignment, which will be essentially 4 questions about the semester. And it's not a test, it's just your response to the material. And you'll be required to make grammatically correct sentence responses to the questions, and then email or turn those in, submit them on the assignment. And that's what it's going to be. And I'm hoping that everybody has, both of you have already emailed me about your projects and everything, haven't you? Okay. All right. Did I respond? Because I've responded to what's that? I didn't to you, Joey?
Yeah, I haven't. I don't think so.
Okay, that's happened to one other person as well, and I don't understand why. Could you email it to me again? Just make a new email to my Utah Tech email address.
Oh, I submitted it through Canvas. That's probably why. Okay.
Well, I think Brittany, you submitted it through Canvas, and I saw it. Yeah,
I did.
so
But
I
sometimes
think
Canvas is funny.
yeah, and it does happen. And like I said, it had somebody in the 2720 class, it happened to them as well. So yeah, just email me through Utah Tech, and if I don't respond to you right away, throw a wet sponge at me in the hallway or something. Give my attention. But yeah, so I hope that everybody does that and has that response. If you're watching this and you haven't, email me through Utah Tech and make sure that I respond. Okay. But thank you guys. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I look forward to visiting with you next week too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. We'll see you guys.
Bye.